So, Professor Robert Pape from the University of Chicago, he's a political scientist and very, very intelligent. He knows his stuff. Um, I've been saying that there is the need to stock up and prepare. And today, Robert Pape came out with this article on Substack that we all need to hear. Um, it particularly tugs at my own heartstrings because, as I've mentioned, I grew up very poor. We didn't even have a car, we didn't have a phone. I remember having to walk several miles to the local Kmart. This was in the 80s, and it was freezing, probably negative 20. My entire family, we had to walk up there to get what we needed. Every day I had to walk a mile to get a free meal. So years later, after serving in the military, I was able to study both finance and marketing. And I studied hard. I got a 3.99 GPA. I know my stuff in finance and marketing both. They were going to give me the Finance Student of the Year award. They didn't because I was already getting the Marketing Student of the Year award. And I just want to read you what my marketing professor had written to me back in 2016. He said, "Thank you, Donald. You are a rock star, and we all are thrilled to see you take the next step in your life. Please don't hesitate to list me as a reference. You should know that your finance professor had his hand in your nomination. He had you on his list for finance as well. All of the business department recognize your ability and your dedication to your courses. We all believe and are proud to have had you in our classes. You have great talent, and any firm would be lucky to have you in their organization. If you are interested and have time, I would encourage you to pursue your MBA or law school. Lawyers need business minds these days, and I will certainly be happy to endorse you. Thank you for giving me the information and for all the wonderful, kind words you had for us. All the best." So I'm not kidding when I say I know my stuff when it comes to finance. And I'm not kidding when I say you need to stock up and prepare, because these prior days I'm about to present, they're not all that long ago.
Two months ago, I warned paid subscribers that the Iran war was not simply creating an oil price spike. It was creating the conditions for shortages, supply disruptions, and eventually economic contraction. The critical point is no longer oil prices alone. The world's emergency buffers, inventories, reserves, subsidies, and logistical workarounds are beginning to fail simultaneously. The key mistake: assuming a very short war. Most commentary still dramatically understates what has been disrupted and its economic impact, including estimates by well-known agencies such as the IMF, business media, and of course, the markets themselves. Indeed, many of you have asked a version of this from one of our community. Serious question. Why is the global economy and stock market so calm right now, as if absolutely nothing is happening? I'm just bewildered. The answer is simple. The estimates have been based on assumptions of a short war. Once the assumption is that the war will last only a few weeks or a month or two, then all of the economic disruption, shipping delays, production stoppages, port congestion due to the closure of Hormuz is both temporary and easily offset by existing inventories and on-site storage. Further, the economic impact on the world's economy is then limited to short-term spikes in prices of oil and other commodities, prices that will quickly fall once the temporary disruption ends. In the short war scenario, the economic shock is largely temporary. Companies draw down inventories, shipping delays clear, and markets eventually revert toward the pre-war equilibrium. Growth slows briefly, then resumes. However, even these estimates understood things would be different with a long war. If the Iran war lasted 3 to 6 months, or longer still. Indeed, they essentially all agree on this, and for another simple reason. The estimates are all based on standard models used by the IMF in estimating the relationship among price of oil, length of the price rise, and macroeconomic effects. The real difference in the impact of the Iran war is contained in the assumption of time. The longer the war, the much more severe the economic impact. Notice also that the different timeframes for the scenarios are not really all that different. There is no scenario for Hormuz remains closed through the fall of 2026 or later. This means that the estimates, essentially all the estimates, have strongly assumed a very short war, always an unrealistic assumption. In other words, the prior estimates have been built on false optimism. In wars, militaries sometimes begin with overly optimistic war plans, assuming great initial victories on the battlefield beyond what a cold assessment would suggest. The reasons are usually political and organizational biases. It would hardly be surprising if similar biases are shaping economic forecasts here. As we all now know, Hormuz is the global energy choke point, where approximately 20% of the world's oil and liquid natural gas and lots of other raw materials and foodstuffs pass through. Due to the Iran-US blockades, about 15 million barrels of oil have been cut off from the world due to Saudi and UAE pipeline bypasses that still allow for some oil to exit, subject, of course, to Iran not deciding to destroy those facilities at some point. No industrial economy can absorb a sustained deficit of that magnitude without drawing down inventories rapidly. As I have explained, the pattern of economic blockades is historically consistent. The first phase produces price spikes without immediate shortages. This is essentially what the current market estimates assume. States draw on reserves and inventories, cushioning the initial shock. Markets adjust, and the system largely absorbs the disruption. The second phase begins once those buffers become central. Prices rise further, airlines cut flights, and shortages begin appearing unevenly across vulnerable economies. But the shock remains partially contained because governments can still draw on inventories and emergency reserves. The third phase is systemic. Once inventories run down to historic lows, production begins to contract as critical inputs fail to arrive. There are no rapid substitutes for 15% of world oil, gas, or petrochemical feedstocks on a timescale short of years to develop new supply. In the third phase, prices still rise, but the shortages become chronic, and governments, companies, and people react accordingly. They ration fuel, prioritize sectors, and determine which industries continue operating and which shut down. This redistributes economic pain unevenly and often reinforces political priorities. This dynamic does not spare the United States. Domestic energy production provides insulation from immediate shortages, but not from global contraction. The U.S. economy depends on international trade in manufactured goods and intermediate inputs. When production systems in Asia and Europe contract, those effects transmit directly into U.S. markets. Energy independence is not economic independence. The 1973 oil crisis is a useful benchmark, but it understates the severity of the current situation. The disruption removed roughly 4 to 5 million barrels per day from global supply, about 7% at the time. The transition from price shock to physical constraint occurred quickly. Petrochemical plants reduced operating rates by 10 to 15%. Fertilizer production declined, and industrial output fell by roughly 3% within 90 days. But the system then had more slack. Demand was less globally concentrated, supply chains were less tightly coupled, and non-OPEC production expanded significantly over time. Today, Asia accounts for more than 1/3 of global oil demand growth, and global production networks operate on tightly synchronized supply chains. Today's system is more efficient in peacetime and more vulnerable to wartime shortages. It is important to stop making the same mistake, assuming Hormuz is about to open in the next week or two. Every hoped-for political off-ramp is visibly collapsing. Iran is not buckling economically. Pakistan is not producing a diplomatic breakthrough. China and Russia are not forcing Tehran to reopen Hormuz. The problem is no longer simply that Hormuz remains blocked. It is that the world's temporary shock absorbers are beginning to fail simultaneously. By 90 days, end of May, the shock globalizes. Strategic reserves, roughly 1.5 billion barrels globally, are drawn down toward operational limits, covering only a fraction of a sustained shortfall. Supply chains are disrupted across sectors simultaneously, and inflation accelerates as a function of constrained inputs rather than monetary conditions. Indeed, the world is on track. Roughly 250 million barrels of oil have already been drawn down since the start of the war through April, according to Bloomberg. Asia, the first epicenter of contraction. Asia will likely face actual contraction first, because Asia sits closest to the physical center of the disruption. No region in the world depends more heavily on uninterrupted Gulf energy flows to sustain industrial production. India has already delayed maintenance on roughly 10,000 megawatts of power generation capacity because fuel conditions remain unstable heading into peak summer demand. Textile mills across Gujarat have begun rolling shutdowns and reduced operating schedules as energy costs surge and coal supplies tighten. Fertilizer production has fallen sharply as LNG shortages constrain ammonia supply. Pakistan has warned publicly that commercial fuel reserves are approaching dangerous levels. Bangladesh continues facing mounting electricity instability tied to imported LNG shortages. Vietnam has already reduced portions of its flight schedules as jet fuel availability tightens across Southeast Asia. These do not represent isolated national problems. They are all manifestations of the same structural mechanism. Multiple industrial economies losing reliable access to critical inputs at the same time. What happens in Asia, however, matters far beyond that region. The American consumer economy remains deeply integrated with Asian manufacturing systems. U.S. imports in electronics, machinery, packaging, plastics, textiles, pharmaceuticals, and industrial components heavily depend on uninterrupted production networks stretching across India, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and coastal China. Indeed, despite Trump's tariffs, Asia currently accounts for roughly half of all U.S. goods imports, and so losses of manufacturing in Asia will show up as higher prices in America. Europe, the LNG time bomb. Europe faces a different but potentially more destabilizing version of the same crisis. After the collapse of Russian pipeline gas, Europe rebuilt much of its industrial energy system around imported LNG. Qatar became one of the central pillars of that replacement strategy. Now the replacement system itself is beginning to fail. Europe exited winter with gas storage levels substantially below recent years after a colder than expected heating season and years of structurally elevated energy demand. It now faces the task of refilling reserves for next winter while competing against Asia for a shrinking pool of globally available LNG cargoes in a market where Qatari exports remain heavily constrained. Worse, Europe therefore risks becoming the second bidder in a tightening global LNG market. Asia holds the stronger position in that competition because Asian economies possess higher immediate industrial dependence on Gulf energy, pay higher spot prices during shortages, and maintain long-term contractual relationships that suppliers are reluctant to break. The consequences are already starting. Dutch TTF gas prices have surged sharply again after months of relative stabilization. German industrial firms are warning publicly about renewed energy stress. Fertilizer producers continue operating below pre-war capacity. Chemical plants across Germany and the Netherlands remain vulnerable to another sustained jump in gas costs. Steel, machinery, automotive, glass, and industrial manufacturing sectors remain deeply exposed to prolonged energy instability. Already, Europe faces tightening jet fuel inventories heading into peak summer travel demand. Inventories at the Amsterdam-Rotterdam-Antwerp hub have fallen toward levels historically associated with supply stress. Airlines are cutting routes quickly. Industrial production will face impacts, but are less agile to avoid actual contraction. The broader danger is that European governments are again being trapped between inflation, industrial slowdown, and rising political pressure simultaneously. Those were the conditions that impacted Western Europe during the 1970s, and they are beginning to reappear. The United States, the diesel time bomb. The United States produces roughly 12 to 13 million barrels of oil per day, providing a buffer against direct supply shocks. But America remains deeply vulnerable to tightening global diesel markets, slowing world trade, and disruption across international freight and manufacturing systems. Here's why. Because crude oil is a globally traded commodity, its price is set by international supply and demand, not domestic production. Even though the U.S. is the world's largest oil producer, American oil companies sell their supply to the highest bidder on the world market, which means U.S. drivers pay the same global price. This especially impacts the price of diesel. Diesel is the critical product in any oil shortage, for two reasons. First, diesel fuel is harder and more expensive to produce than gasoline. Second, diesel demand is much harder to reduce. People can drive less or postpone trips when gasoline prices rise. But farms still need tractors. Stores still need trucks. Ports still need cargo equipment. Railroads still need freight engines. Oil moves cars. Diesel moves economies. And in prolonged energy crises, diesel gets priority everywhere at once. During the 1973 to 74 oil shock, diesel shortages and surging freight costs contributed directly to rising food prices, farm stress, construction slowdowns, trucking disruptions, and industrial contraction across the United States. Independent truckers struggled to absorb fuel costs. Manufacturers faced rising shipping and input costs simultaneously. By 1974, inflation and unemployment were both rising together as economic growth weakened sharply, and diesel was at the core of the problem. U.S. diesel inventories have already fallen below normal seasonal levels in several regions, especially along the East Coast, while diesel refining margins have surged as global refining systems struggle to replace lost Gulf supply. At the same time, refinery capacity remains constrained after years of refinery closures and underinvestment following COVID and the post-2020 energy downturn. By late April, diesel inventories had tightened significantly. U.S. agriculture is particularly exposed because diesel fuels planting, harvesting, and distribution, while imported manufactured goods are beginning to face delays and rising costs. Within the next 30 days, mid-June, diesel inventories will be drawn down to operational limits, and everyone will see this coming in the coming week or two. As of late April, U.S. diesel stockpiles stood at approximately 102 to 106.7 million barrels, the lowest level for this time of year since the 1996 to 2003 period, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. At current consumption rates of approximately 4.2 million barrels per day, this represents roughly 25 days of supply coverage, below levels typically considered adequate buffers against unexpected demand or supply disruptions. At $6 or more per gallon nationally, diesel would be entering rare territory. The direct and indirect impact will fall on higher food prices, elevated manufactured goods, freight costs, and construction project delays. In other words, inflation and unemployment will come under heavy pressure, the familiar pattern from the 1970s. There is one notable exception: China. Beijing entered the crisis with approximately 1.39 billion barrels in total storage as of early March 2026, enough to cover roughly 120 days of net crude imports at 2025 levels. China has been drawing on those reserves steadily, even as it continued to receive limited Iranian crude flows through the strait. Iran managed to ship at least 11.7 million barrels of crude to China in the weeks after the war began, predominantly via vessels operating with disabled tracking. China's crude imports fell 20% in April compared to the prior year, and Beijing has slashed imports by approximately a quarter from pre-war levels. Sustained at that pace, China's strategic buffer would face meaningful pressure within 12 to 18 months. China is therefore not immune to the crisis. But unlike most major importing economies, it entered the war with unusually large strategic reserves, tighter state control over allocation, and greater capacity to absorb industrial disruption politically. That asymmetry matters strategically. Just as China emerged from COVID economically stronger relative to many Western economies, Beijing is now positioned to weather the Iran shock more effectively than many major competitors. This helps to explain Xi's confidence at the summit with Trump and reluctance to pressure Iran to open Hormuz, at least for this year. Summing it up, the April phase of this crisis was governed by one mechanism: price shock, then physical shortage. The summer will be governed by a far more dangerous mechanism: shortage, then synchronized economic contraction. What will characterize the next global economic shockwave from the Iran war is not losing individual commodities, but multiple ticking time bombs detonating simultaneously. What to watch next? 3 indicators will determine whether the next shock of the Iran war occurs over the next 10 to 30 days. First, inventories. Watch U.S. East Coast diesel inventories, European LNG storage levels, and Asian jet fuel reserves. U.S. distillate inventories are already running roughly 11 to 18% below seasonal norms, while European gas storage remains near 30 to 35% full, far below the roughly 55% level Europe normally enters summer with. Historically, once inventories fall below roughly 20 to 25 days of forward demand coverage, governments begin losing the ability to stabilize shortages through temporary releases and subsidies alone. Second, industrial slowdown. Watch for refinery utilization cuts in India and South Korea, fertilizer shutdowns tied to LNG shortages, falling container freight volumes, and airline route reductions across Asia and Europe. If major Asian refiners begin reducing throughput by 10 to 15%, or if airlines begin cutting summer schedules by another 5 to 10% because of jet fuel shortages rather than weak demand, the crisis has likely entered synchronized contraction. Third, political intervention. Export controls, diesel allocation programs, anti-price gouging measures, emergency food subsidies, and fuel rationing indicate governments are entering the political phase of the crisis. Early warning signs include limits on diesel purchases, restrictions on fertilizer exports, government fuel allocation orders, and emergency price caps spreading across multiple countries simultaneously. That is the real historical threshold. The real danger is not simply inflation or shortages alone. It is governments progressively losing the ability to stabilize the economic system itself.
There's really nothing I can add.